My lawyer told me to stop talking in court because he was secretly working with my ex. I remember the moment I realized my attorney was working against me, as if it happened just minutes ago. My heart pounded so hard I thought everyone in the courtroom could hear it, and my hands trembled under the table. I had just begun to speak, about to disclose important financial documents that would prove my ex-husband was hiding assets, when I felt a sharp, unmistakable pressure on my foot. That pressure came from the very man who claimed to represent me. My lawyer, supposedly on my side, who in a tense hiss told me to shut up. I froze. Time seemed to slow as I glanced over at him in disbelief, his expression cold and impatient, and in that instant, everything I thought I knew about our relationship unraveled. I realized I was caught in a trap, but I had no idea how deep it went until I began to piece together every strange moment leading up to that day. My ex-husband, whom I'll call Ostap, and I had been married for 4 years, though our relationship deteriorated quickly in the latter half of that time. When we first got together, it was like falling into a vivid whirlwind romance. Friends told us we were rushing things, but we felt nothing could go wrong. He was charming, attentive, quick-witted, a man who made me believe he was the perfect partner. I believed that so wholeheartedly that when we had our simple, intimate wedding, I was convinced I was embarking on a lifetime of happiness. The first cracks appeared so quietly that I struggled to understand what was happening. He became increasingly controlling, though at first he disguised it as loving concern. He insisted I text him when I went anywhere or when I got home from work, claiming he worried about my safety. It was flattering at the start, but little by little, it escalated. He'd insist on checking my phone to ensure I hadn't communicated with untrustworthy people. If I was even 20 minutes late returning from the grocery store, he demanded I explain every detail of where I'd been. It was as if my life was put under a microscope, but I kept telling myself that was just his way of showing he cared. In the space of a year, that care turned into a disturbing, ever-present sense of being watched. We fought constantly. Sometimes those fights ended in me locked in the bathroom, tears rolling down my face, trying to hold myself together while he pounded on the door. He never actually hit me, but the verbal aggression and relentless accusations felt like fists beating into my spirit. It was exhausting. Eventually, I learned he was also funneling money in suspicious ways. One night, I found documents in his office that hinted at hidden bank accounts and business deals I had never heard of. When I tried to ask him about it, he blew up at me. The intimidation, the pressure, the scorn in his eyes left me in no doubt. I was not safe at home. I knew I had to leave. I also knew it would be messy. Ostap hated losing control, so divorcing him felt terrifying. But I had reached a point where I could no longer pretend it would get better. My only relief was in thinking I would finally be free once the divorce was settled. But as soon as I told him I was filing, he barely blinked before saying, "You'll regret this. You think you're so smart. Let's see how it turns out for you." In hindsight, I realized that cold statement was the starting shot of the real battle. I decided I needed an excellent lawyer, someone tough but honest, who specialized in family law. I didn't have a long list of contacts for legal help, so I began by asking friends and acquaintances. That's how I ended up interviewing 3 different attorneys. The first one, to be blunt, seemed completely indifferent. He spent more time scrolling his phone than asking me questions. The second was more engaged, but admitted he couldn't commit enough time because his caseload was overloaded. The third lawyer, whose name was Andrew, made a striking first impression. Neat, articulate, with an office in a nice part of town. Not huge, but tidy, and decorated with diplomas and success stories on the walls. He seemed to radiate confidence. We spoke for nearly 90 minutes, during which he laid out possibilities and even offered strategic insights about how we could prove Ostap was hiding assets and how I could claim my fair share. His intelligence and directness reassured me. Even his fee, which was quite high, felt justified by the expertise he appeared to provide. When he said, "Trust me, I'll make sure you get everything you deserve," I felt a glimmer of hope. In those early weeks, Andrew really did seem invested. He gathered data, listened carefully to my recollections of our marriage, asked probing questions about my finances, and said we'd probably need a forensic accountant if Ostap was truly diverting large sums of money. At the first hearing, which addressed preliminary concerns like temporary spousal support and living arrangements, he appeared poised and combative in just the right way, especially when Ostap's lawyer tried to portray me as irrational and too emotional to handle negotiations. Andrew shot back with incisive remarks about the facts and calmly reminded the court that my request for an equitable share of our property was within my rights. I sat there relieved that he was so assertive and convinced I'd chosen the best advocate possible. However, tiny misgivings started popping up almost from the start, though I dismissed them at first. During that first hearing, I recall the judge directing a question to me about one of my calls to the police. Ostap had made a scene late one night, shouting and cursing, culminating in me calling the cops to de-escalate. I wanted to recount the entire story. Sure, it would strengthen my case for the emotional torment I endured. But as soon as I began speaking, Andrew lightly pressed on my arm and whispered, "Just say you don't remember all the details right now. Trust me." I hesitated, but I did what he said. Afterward, I asked him why he'd stopped me from telling the whole story, and he said, "We need to reveal it at the right moment. We don't want to put all our cards on the table just yet." It sounded like a reasonable tactic, so I went along with it. Another time, I let him know I had a bank statement that verified significant transfers from Ostap's primary account into what looked like shell companies. I was excited. Here was evidence of his attempts to hide assets. I assumed we should rush this into court. Instead, Andrew said, "No, not now. We have to keep that quiet. The other side might try to challenge the legality of how you obtained it. And besides, we'll deploy it strategically later so they won't have time to refute it properly." Something about that explanation gave me an uneasy feeling. But he was the legal professional, not me. Time marched on. Hearings were rescheduled multiple times for various reasons. Ostap claiming illness or the court's schedule conflicting. I felt overwhelmed. Each delay meant more days of anxiety. Meanwhile, Andrew began to cancel our meetings more often, or ignore my texts for days. When we did manage to meet, he appeared rushed, his eyes darting around. But he still flashed confident smiles, insisting, "Everything's under control. Relax." My gut told me something was off. But I fought against that suspicion, telling myself that big-shot lawyers often juggle many cases and can't hold my hand every step of the way. The real alarm sounded when a friend of mine, who worked near the courthouse, casually mentioned she'd seen Andrew having coffee with Ostap. I nearly choked on my drink. Why would my own lawyer be meeting socially with my soon-to-be ex-husband? Especially if Ostap already had his own lawyer? My friend was adamant that they didn't appear to be in a formal meeting. There was no sign of Ostap's attorney. Instead, they seemed relaxed, even friendly, as if they were longtime buddies. When I confronted Andrew, he mumbled something vague about wanting to propose a settlement and the other lawyer being unable to attend, so Ostap came himself. He brushed it off as routine, but his flustered manner set every nerve in me on edge. Still, I lacked proof of any wrongdoing, so I just tucked my concerns away, hoping I was overreacting. A few days later, I overheard a conversation in the corridor. One of Ostap's acquaintances mentioned that his side had solid intel about my legal strategies, that they were confident they could sabotage my claims in court. That hammered at me. How could they know about my most recent plans, which I'd only ever discussed in detail with Andrew behind closed doors? I asked him directly, "Are you leaking my information?" He pretended to be offended, calling my fears ridiculous and emotional nonsense. Once again, I allowed myself to be persuaded by his smooth talk, but it was getting harder to push away the sense that I was being manipulated. Then came the day everything imploded. We were entering the most important hearing, the matter of dividing our property and potential alimony. This was the time to show the court the evidence of Ostap's hidden accounts. I felt both dread and anticipation. Dread because confronting him was always nerve-wracking. Anticipation because I believed I finally held the key to victory. Right before we walked into the courtroom, I reminded Andrew about the bank documents, telling him I planned on presenting them. He flat out told me, "No, under no circumstances do you mention them today." I was dumbfounded. Why keep them secret when the judge had explicitly asked us to bring forth any evidence related to financial misconduct? He gave me the same old line. "This is about timing. If you reveal them now, you might undermine your own position." The logic made no sense to me, but before I could press him further, we were called in. I took my seat in front of the judge, my heartbeat quickening, the file with those documents in my bag. The judge looked at both sides, reiterating the significance of total transparency in financial matters. Then he directed his gaze at me, saying, "Do you have any evidence that would demonstrate your husband deliberately concealed his assets from you?" I felt my breath catch. It was the perfect cue. I started to say, "Yes, Your Honor, I have," but before I could finish, Andrew slid his foot onto mine, pressing hard enough to hurt. I was so startled I paused mid-sentence. He leaned over just enough to hiss, "Shut your mouth," in the coldest voice I'd ever heard from him. It was as if a veil lifted from my eyes, revealing that everything had been a lie. The betrayal was so stark, so horrifying, I almost burst into tears on the spot, but I was too paralyzed by shock to respond. The judge waited, then, seeing I was apparently speechless, moved on to the next question. Ostap's smug expression was a dagger to my heart. He knew he was winning. When the hearing concluded, I cornered Andrew in the hallway, demanding an explanation. He brushed me off with an icy glare. "I'm the lawyer here," he said bluntly. "Don't you dare mess up my plan." At that moment, Every shred of faith I had in him crumbled. Worse, I realized I'd already paid him a large portion of his fee, and I had no other attorney lined up. I fled the building and sat in my car, panting with anger and grief, tears streaming uncontrollably. I called a friend who worked in the courthouse, blurting out the entire story, and she calmly confirmed my worst suspicions. "He's known to have these side arrangements," she said. "You need a new lawyer? Fast. And you should document everything you've experienced." When I tried to contact Andrew to terminate our agreement, he simply didn't respond. Now it was perfectly clear. I was on my own. Desperate, I began phoning every legal contact I had. That's when I was introduced to Anastasia, a relatively young but fiercely competent family law attorney who was gaining a reputation for defending people in high-stakes divorces. I explained my predicament to her, sparing no detail about how I suspected Andrew had sabotaged my case. Far from being daunted, she seemed energized by the challenge. "We can do this," she insisted. "We'll not only fight for your fair share, we'll make sure that man is held accountable for his unethical behavior." Her determination soothed the raw panic inside me. For the first time in weeks, I felt that my story might end with some semblance of justice. I formally fired Andrew, signing the necessary paperwork to revoke his representation. Then I showed everything to Anastasia. The bank records, the messages with Andrew, my notes about all the suspicious events, and even statements from a friend who had witnessed Andrew meeting with Ostap in that cafe. Anastasia's eyes narrowed with fury as she flipped through the pages, muttering curses under her breath about people who gave lawyers a bad name. She helped me compose a complaint to the local bar association, alleging that Andrew had violated attorney-client privilege and acted with gross misconduct. We attached all the evidence we could gather. Our next move was to request that the court allow additional evidence, explaining how my original lawyer had prevented me from revealing critical documents. Luckily, the judge listened attentively. He granted me a brief delay to let my new attorney get up to speed. When we returned, Anastasia was ready and fired up. The difference in representation was like night and day. Instead of me sitting quietly, intimidated into silence, I watched as Anastasia laid out every fact with calm precision. She explained that we had documents showing substantial bank transfers to accounts that didn't appear in Ostap's official financial disclosures. She backed up these findings with an analysis from a financial expert who had found suspicious patterns in certain transactions. She also pointed out the large gap between Ostap's stated income and the lifestyle he displayed. Ostap's lawyer, the same one who had stood by smugly while Andrew forced me to keep quiet, tried to counter that the documents were invalid or unethically obtained. Anastasia was ready for that. She recited the relevant statutes on the right of a spouse to investigate marital assets if there's suspicion of concealment. The judge seemed interested, especially when Anastasia explained that my original lawyer's sabotage was why the information was submitted belatedly. Our friend from the courthouse, who had seen Andrew and Ostap together, provided a sworn statement about their meeting, further casting doubt on Andrew's impartiality and giving credibility to the idea that my side had been compromised. Ostap, for his part, did everything he could to deflect blame. He portrayed me as vindictive, claimed the accounts were never his, insisted he was an honest businessman victimized by a spiteful ex. But as the hearing continued, the evidence mounted against him. The bank statements, real numbers, and traceable transfers left him looking cornered. The judge ordered a further investigation into the accounts, and while it was time-consuming and complicated, the final conclusion was that yes, Ostap had concealed marital assets, and a portion of them rightfully belonged to me. The court awarded me a significant share of what had been hidden, plus alimony for a set period. Ostap's rage was palpable, though I suspect he knew the jig was up long before the final decision. While he appealed everything he could, the basic judgment stood. It didn't make me wealthy overnight, but it established that I deserved a substantial portion of our shared property. Just as importantly, it vindicated me. For so long, I had felt powerless, manipulated by a husband who used intimidation and a lawyer who colluded with him. Now I felt heard. Once the divorce issues were settled enough for me to breathe, Anastasia and I pressed on with the complaint against Andrew. To my astonishment, the disciplinary board took interest in the case quite seriously. It's not easy to prove an attorney conspired against his own client, but we had multiple pieces of evidence and testimonies indicating suspicious behavior. The withheld documents, the direct contradictions between his recommended strategies and standard legal practice, and the personal meetings with the opposing party. After a formal review, Andrew faced disciplinary action. He lost his license for a period and received a penalty that tarnished his professional record. I later learned I wasn't his only victim. Others had experienced similar betrayals but were too emotionally or financially drained to pursue justice. Seeing him finally face consequences was a triumph in its own right. In the midst of it all, my life moved forward. I managed to secure a modest but comfortable apartment, no longer under Ostap's roof. I found a sense of calm I hadn't felt in years. Gone were the nights I lay awake, worried about him stalking through the house, throwing verbal tirades or mocking every phone call I made. I started realizing how liberating it was not to be monitored every second. The emotional healing took more time, but step by step, I regained my confidence. The money I obtained from the court ruling certainly helped me rebuild, but the true victory was the knowledge that I hadn't allowed them to crush my voice forever. Whenever people ask about my divorce now, I find myself recounting not just the heartbreak of leaving an abusive partner, but also the shocking betrayal by the lawyer I hired to protect me. I warn them to be careful when selecting legal counsel. Read reviews, talk to former clients if possible, and never ignore your instincts if something feels wrong. Lawyers can be formidable allies, but if you sense they're pushing you to remain silent where you need to speak up, that's a huge red flag. I also discovered the power of standing up for myself the moment my spirit told me something was off. The very day Andrew told me in that venomous whisper to shut my mouth was the day I finally acted. Though I regret not recognizing his sabotage earlier, at least I found the courage to walk away instead of continuing in blind faith. I realized that no matter how professional someone seems, if they consistently undermine your right to tell the truth, they're probably serving interests other than yours. Meanwhile, Ostap tries to spin stories about how he was the victim. He calls me a cheat, says I plotted against him with unfair legal tactics. He still tries to duck out of paying exactly what he owes, but his anger no longer terrifies me. I've stood my ground in court. I've looked him in the eye, testified about what happened, and let the evidence speak. People can believe what they want. I know the truth, and I know there are official court documents backing it up. Some nights, I lie in bed, my mind drifting to that horrifying moment in the courtroom when I realized the person sitting next to me was no ally. I recall the flush of betrayal, the numb shock, but then I remind myself that as painful as it was, it also marked the start of my liberation. From then on, I could see the path clearly. Fire him, gather evidence, seek a genuine advocate, fight tooth and nail for my rights. Without that revelation, I might have lost every chance to stand up for myself. Instead, I ended up forging a new life, maybe with some scars, but definitely with a firmer sense of who I am and what I deserve. I've shared my story with several women and men who faced similar experiences. Some had controlling spouses. Others found themselves saddled with unethical counsel. They told me they felt powerless and isolated, afraid to speak out. My advice has always been, your voice is often your most formidable tool. If someone repeatedly urges you to stay silent, question their motives. A legitimate lawyer can certainly advise you about timing and the best ways to present evidence, but they shouldn't muzzle you at every critical juncture. There's a world of difference between strategic guidance and blatant suppression. Looking back, I realize it wasn't just Ostap who tested my resilience. It was Andrew's betrayal that truly forced me to confront how vulnerable we can be when we place our faith in the wrong person. Yet it also highlighted my inner strength once I decided to fight back. I went from feeling manipulated and cornered to holding my head high, convinced that truth, once given a chance, can prevail. I'm not naive enough to think that all's fair in the world of divorce proceedings or that corruption doesn't exist in every corner of the system. But my experience taught me there are good people too, like Anastasia, who genuinely want to see justice served. It taught me the importance of forging a support network, friends, family, professional allies, because battling on your own is excruciatingly hard. Most of all, it showed me that even when you've been silenced, the moment you break that silence can shift everything. Now, with my divorce final and a sense of normalcy creeping back into my life, I feel more in control than ever before. Sure, I sometimes still have nightmares about the final months of our marriage or that day in court, but they remind me how far I've come. If there's one takeaway from this journey, it's that your own courage can be the difference between being used as a pawn and living freely on your own terms. The people who try to oppress you might laugh or sneer, but they won't have the last word if you stand firm. Yes, there were moments I wished I'd caught on sooner, that I'd walked out of Andrew's office the minute he first told me to withhold important details from the judge. But regrets are only valuable if they guide us to make better choices next time. Today, I would never ignore the warning signs I overlooked then. I'd never let a so-called defender isolate me from my own case. I'd demand clarity, honesty, and consistent communication. That's the best lesson I could have taken from being misled by the very man hired to shield me. Sometimes people ask if I'm still angry with Andrew. I feel more sadness than anger, knowing that someone could exploit vulnerable people who rely on his expertise. I can't speak for him or guess whether he regrets his actions. Perhaps he thought the easy money from Ostap was worth it. that he could keep deceiving clients without consequence. But thanks to what we uncovered, he's been held accountable to some extent. If that prevents even one more person from being betrayed the way I was, it's worth the lengthy fight. As for Ostap, I can't say I ever truly made sense of why he escalated so far. Maybe it was about control. Maybe he felt wounded by my decision to leave. He might never see himself as the villain of our story, and maybe from his perspective, he isn't. But none of that changes the fact that he tried to trap me financially and psychologically, and that he found a lawyer willing to help him. I had to face both of them, and eventually broke free from the ugly dynamic they created. I no longer question whether I did the right thing by ending the marriage. It was unquestionably necessary for my health and safety. If someone reading this is in a similar predicament, facing an ex-partner who aims to ruin you financially, or suspecting that your own lawyer might be siding with your opponent, please believe that there is a way through. Document everything. Seek out a second opinion, trust your instincts, and do not be afraid to take drastic measures if you must. Let my story serve as a reminder that silence can be used as a weapon against you. The minute I was able to speak for myself and reject the hold my lawyer had on me, everything turned around. Not instantly, not without a fight, but it turned around all the same. I still think about that day, when my lawyer said, "Shut your mouth," and forced me to hold back crucial evidence. My regret is not standing up that instant in front of the judge and telling the court that my own attorney was stopping me from presenting the truth. But I did find the courage soon after. That single choice, to walk away from him and find someone who would truly fight for me, altered the trajectory of the case. Perhaps I lost a bit of time and money by trusting him initially, but in the end, I gained something invaluable. The awareness that I had the power to change my fate. I was not doomed to let them walk all over me. My silence was temporary, but their wrongdoing was permanent. And so now I live in my small, comfortable apartment, forging a new chapter without the shackles of an emotionally abusive marriage or a duplicitous lawyer. I have a sense of peace, something that felt impossible a year ago. Whenever someone comments that I seem stronger than before, I remember that strength was always there. I just hadn't been forced to tap into it. My hope is that nobody else has to face that kind of double-crossing scenario. But if they do, may they be quicker to sense the betrayal than I was. May they stand up for themselves the moment their gut says, something's wrong. Because sometimes that instinct is the loudest warning you'll get, and ignoring it can cost you dearly. Ultimately, my story is about a woman who refused to stay silent when her own lawyer betrayed her trust. And it's also about the journey to reclaim one's power after being systematically undermined. I found the right allies, I presented the truth, and I refused to let that betrayal define my outcome. If I learned anything at all, it's that the drive to seek justice, once awakened, can be unstoppable. Even if you've been shut down before, you can always find your voice again. And the moment you do, the people who thought they could use your silence as their weapon discover just how powerless they truly are.